It was in London then, and at first we in England did not realize how grave the situation was, nor how distressing its results would be. For my own part, though chagrined at losing a considerable sum, it was for the most part paper profits that I lost, and when the dust had settled, I found myself little the poorer in cash. I knew that Elliot had been gambling heavily and feared that he was badly hit, but I did not see him till we both returned to the Riviera for Christmas. He told me that Henry Matron was dead and Gray ruined. I know little of business matters, and I dare say that my accounts of the events given me by Elliot will seem confused. So far as I could make out, the catastrophe that had befallen the firm was due in part to Henry Matron's self-will and in part to Gray's rashness. Henry Matron, at first, would not believe that the break was serious, but persuaded himself that it was a plot of the New York brokers to put a quick one over their provincial brethren, and setting his teeth, he poured forth money to support the market. He raged against the Chicago brokers who were letting themselves be stampeded by those scoundrels in New York. He had always prided himself on the fact that none of the smaller clients, widows with settled incomes, retired officers, and such like, had ever lost a penny by following his advice, and now, instead of letting them take a loss, he supported their accounts out of his own pocket. He said he was prepared to go broke. He could make another fortune, but he could never hold up his head again if the little people who trusted him all lost their all. He thought he was magnanimous. He was only vain. His great fortune melted, and one night he had a heart attack. He was in his 60s. He had always worked hard, played hard, eaten too much, and drunk heavily. After a few hours of agony, he died of coronary thrombosis. Gray was left to deal with the situation alone. He had been speculating extensively on the side without the knowledge of his father, and was personally in the greatest difficulty. His efforts to extricate himself failed. The banks would not lend him money. Older men on the exchange told him that the only thing was to throw up the sponge. I am not clear about the rest of the story. He was unable to meet his obligations and was, I understand, declared bankrupt. He had already mortgaged his own house and was glad to hand it over to the mortgagees. His father's house on Lakeshore Drive and the house at Maugham were sold for what they would fetch. Isabel sold her jewels. All that was left them was the plantation, South Carolina, which was settled on Isabel and for which a purchaser could not be found. Gray was wiped out. "And what about you, Elliot?" I asked. "Oh, I'm not complaining," he answered airily. "God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb." I did not question him further, for his financial affairs were no business of mine, but whatever his losses were, I presumed that, like the rest of us, he had suffered. The depression did not at first hit the Riviera badly. I heard of 2 or 3 people who had lost a good deal. Many villas remained closed for the winter, and several were put up for sale. The hotels were far from full, and the casino at Monte Carlo complained that the season was poor. But it was not for a couple of years that the drought made itself felt. Then an estate agent told me that on the stretch of coast that reaches from Toulon to the Italian border, there were 48,000 properties, large and small, to be sold. The shares of the casino slumped. The great hotels put down their prices in vain to attempt to attract. The only foreigners to be seen were those who had always been so poor that they couldn't be poor, and they spent no money because they had no money to spend. The shopkeepers were in despair, but Elliot neither diminished his staff nor lessen their wages as many did. He continued to provide choice food and choice wines to royal entitled persons. He bought himself a large new car, which he imported from America, and on which he had to pay a heavy duty. He gave generously to the charity the bishop had organized to provide free meals for the families of the workless. In fact, he lived as though there had never been a crisis and half the world was not staggering from its effects. I discovered the reason by chance. Elliot had by this time ceased to go to England except for a fortnight once a year to buy clothes, but he still transferred his establishment to his apartment in Paris for 3 months in the autumn and for May and June, these being the periods when the Riviera was deserted by Elliot's friends. He liked the summer there, partly on account of the bathing, but chiefly, I think, because the hot weather gave him the opportunity to indulge in a gaiety of dress that his sense of decorum had always forced him to eschew. He would appear then in trousers of startling color, red, blue, green, or yellow, and with them wear singlets of contrasting hue, mauve, violet, puce, or harlequin, and would accept the compliments his attire clamored for with the depreciating grace of an actress who is told that she has played a new role divinely. I happened to be spending a day in Paris in the spring on my way back to Cap Ferret and had asked Elliot to lunch with me. We met in the Ritz bar, no longer thronged with college boys come from America to have a good time, but as deserted as a playwright after the first night of an unsuccessful play. We had a cocktail, a transatlantic habit to which Elliot had at last become reconciled, and ordered our lunch. When we had finished, he suggested that we should go round the curio shops, and though I told him I had no money to spend, I was glad enough to accompany him. We walked to the Palace Vendome and asked if I would mind going into Charvet's for a moment. He had ordered some things and wanted to know if they were ready. It appeared that he was having some vests made and some drawers, and he was having his initials embroidered on them. The vests had not come in yet, but the drawers were there, and the shop assistant asked Elliot if he would like to see them. I would, he said, and when the man had gone to fetch them, added to me, I have them made to order on a pattern of my own. They were brought, and to me, except that they were of silk, looked exactly like the drawers I had frequently bought for myself at Macy's. But what caught my eye was that above the intertwined E.T. of the initials was a count's crown. I did not say a word. Very nice, said Elliot. Well, when the undershirts are ready, you'll send them along. We left the shop, and Elliot, as he walked away, turned to me with a smile. Did you notice the crown? To tell you the truth, I'd forgotten about it when he asked you to come to Charvet's. I don't think I've had occasion to tell you that His Holiness has been graciously pleased to revive in my favor my old family title. Your what? I said, startled out of my politeness. Elliot raised a disapproving eyebrow. Didn't you know? I am descendant of the female line from the Count de Lara, who came over from England in the suite of Philip II and married a maid of honor of Queen Mary's. Our old friend Bloody Mary? That, I believe, is what heretics call her, Elliot answered stiffly. I don't think I ever told you that I spent September of 29 in Rome. I thought it a bore having to go because Rome is empty then, but it was fortunate for me that my sense of duty prevailed over my desire for worldly pleasures. My friends at the Vatican told me that the crash was coming and strongly advised me to sell all my American securities. The Catholic Church has the wisdom of 20 centuries behind it, and I didn't hesitate for a moment. I cabled to Henry Matron to sell everything and buy gold, and I cabled to Louisa to tell her to do the same. Henry cabled back asking me if I was crazy and said he'd do nothing until I confirmed the instructions. I immediately cabled in the most peremptory manner, telling him to carry them out and to cable me that he had done so. Poor Louisa paid no attention to my advice and suffered for it. So when the crash came, you were sitting pretty? An Americanism, my dear fellow, which I see no occasion for you to use, but it expresses my situation with a good deal of accuracy. I lost nothing. In fact, I had made what you would probably call a packet. I was able some time later to buy back my securities for a fraction of their original cost, and since I owed it all to what I can only describe as a direct interposition of Providence, I felt it only right and proper that I should do something for Providence in return. Oh, and how did you set about doing that? Well, you know, the Deuce has been reclaiming great tracts of land in the Pontine marshes, and it was representing to me that His Holiness was gravely concerned at the lack of places for worship of the settlers. So, to cut long story short, I built a little Romanesque church, an exact copy of one I knew in Providence, and perfect in every detail, which though I say it myself, is a gem. It is dedicated to St. Martin because I was lucky enough to find an old stained glass window representing St. Martin in the act of cutting his cloak in two to give half to a naked beggar. And as the symbolism seemed so apt, I bought it and placed it over the high altar. I didn't interrupt Elliot to ask him what connection he saw between the saint's celebrated action and the rake-off on the pretty penny he had made by selling out in the nick of time, which, like an agent's commission, he was paying to a higher power. But to a prosaic person like me, symbolism is often obscure. He went on. When I was privileged to show the photographs of to the Holy Father, he was gracious enough to tell me that he could see at a glance that I was a man of impeccable taste, and he added that it was a pleasure to him to find in his degenerate age someone who combined devotion to the church with such rare artistic gifts. A memorial experience, my dear fellow, a memorial experience. But no one was more surprised than I when, shortly afterwards, it was intimated to me that he had been pleased to confer a title upon me. As an American citizen, I feel it more modest not to use it, except, of course, at the Vatican. So I have forbidden my Joseph to address me as Monsieur le Comte, and I trust you will respect my confidence. I don't wish it brooded abroad, but I would not like His Holiness to think that I do not value the honor that he has done me, and it is purely out of respect for him that I have the crown embroidered on my personal linen. I don't mind telling you that I take a modest pride in concealing my rank under the sober pinstripe of American gentlemen. We parted. Elliot told me he would come down to the Riviera at the end of June. He did not do so. He had just made his arrangements to transfer his staff from Paris, intending to drive down leisurely in his car so that everything should be in perfect order on his arrival, when he received a cable from Isabel to say that her mother had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Elliot, besides being fond of his sister, had, as I have said, a strong strain of family feeling. He took the first ship out of Cherbourg, and from New York went to Chicago. He wrote to tell me that Miss Bradley was very ill and grown so thin that it was a shock to him. She might last a few weeks longer or even a few months, but in any case, he felt it his sad duty to remain with her until the end. He said he found the great heat more supportable than he had expected, but the lack of congenial society only tolerable, because at such a moment he had, in any case, no heart for it. He said he was disappointed with the way his fellow countrymen had reacted to the Depression. He would have expected them to take their misfortunes with more equanimity, knowing that nothing is easier than to bear other people's calamities with fortitude. I thought that Elliot, richer now than he had ever been in his life, was perhaps hardly entitled to be severe. He ended by giving me messages for several of his friends and bade me by no means to forget to explain to everyone I met why it was that his house must remain closed for the summer. A little more than a month later, I received another letter from him to tell me that Miss Bradley had died. He wrote with sincerity and emotion. I should never have thought him capable of expressing himself with such dignity, real feeling, and simplicity, had I not long known that, notwithstanding his snobbishness and his absurd affectations, Elliot was a kindly, affectionate, and honest man. In the course of this letter he told me that Miss Bradley's affairs appeared to be in some disorder. Her elder son, a diplomatist, being in charge of affairs in Tokyo during the absence of the ambassador, had been, of course, unable to leave his post. Her second son, Templeton, who had been in the Philippines when I first knew the Bradleys, had been in due course recalled to Washington and occupied a responsible position in the State Department. He had come with his wife to Chicago when his mother's condition was recognized as hopeless, but had been obliged to return to the capital immediately after the funeral. In these circumstances, Elliot felt that he must remain in America until things were straightened out. Miss Bradley had divided her fortune equally between her 3 children, but it appeared that her losses in the crash of '29 had been substantial. Fortunately, they had found a purchaser for the farm at Maugham. Elliot, in his letter, referred to it as dear Louisa's country place. It is always sad when a family has to part with its ancestral home, he wrote. But of late years I have seen this forced upon so many of my English friends that I feel that my nephews and Isabel must accept the inevitable with the same courage and resignation that they have. They had been lucky, too, in disposing of Miss Bradley's house in Chicago. There had long been a scheme afoot to tear down the row of houses in one of which Miss Bradley lived and build in their stead a great block of apartments, but it had been held up by her obstinate determination to die in the house in which she had lived. But no sooner was the breath out of her body than the promoters came forward with an offer, and it was promptly accepted. Yet, even at that, Isabel was left very ill provided for. After the crash, Gray had tried to get a job, even as a clerk in the office of such of the brokers he had weathered the storm, but there was no business. He applied to his friends to give him something to do, however humble and however badly paid, but he applied in vain. His frenzied efforts to stave off the disaster that finally overwhelmed him, the burden of anxiety, the humiliation, resulted in nervous breakdown, and he began to have headaches so severe that he was incapacitated for 24 hours and as limp as a wet rag when they ceased. He had appeared to Isabel that they could not do better than go down with the children to the plantation in South Carolina till Gray regained his health. In its day, it had brought in $100,000 a year for its rice crop, but for long now had been no more than a wilderness of marsh and gumwood, useful only to sportsmen who wanted to shoot duck, and no purchaser could be found for it. There they had lived off and on since the crash, and there they proposed to return till conditions improved and Gray could find employment. I couldn't allow that, Elliot wrote. Why, my dear fellow, they live like pigs. Isabel without a maid, no governess for the children, and only a couple of women to look after them. So I've offered them my apartment in Paris and proposed that they should stay there until things change in this fantastic country. I shall provide them with a staff. As a matter of fact, my kitchen maid is a very good cook, so I shall leave her with them, and I can easily find someone to take her place. I shall arrange to settle the accounts myself so that Isabel can spend her small income on her clothes and things the family needs. This means, of course, that I shall spend much more of my time on the Riviera, and so hope to see a great deal more of you, my dear fellow, than I have in the past. London and Paris being now what they are, I'm really more at home on the Riviera. It's the only place remaining where I can meet people who speak my own language. I dare say I shall go to Paris now and then for a few days, but when I do, I don't in the least mind picking it at the Ritz. I'm glad to say that I've at long last persuaded Gray and Isabel to accede to my wishes, and I'm bringing them all over as soon as the necessary arrangements can be made. The furniture and the pictures, very poor in quality, my dear fellow, and of the most doubtful authenticity, are being sold the week after next. And meanwhile, as I thought to live in the house till the last moment would be painful to them, I have brought them here to stay with me at the Drake. I shall settle them in when we get to Paris, and then come down to the Riviera. Don't forget to remember me to your royal neighbor. Who could deny that Elliot, that arch snob, was also the kindest, most considerate, and generous of men?